Hello and welcome to Concilium. I'm here today with Dan Mitchell, who is a Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, interested in tax policy, fiscal policy, government spending issues. He's been involved in giving advice to some very senior US politicians, and of course he's been published in all the key leading papers and journals in the United States. Dan, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, glad to be here.
Excellent. Let's talk first about activist fiscal policy. One of the things that has come out of the GFC is a resurrection almost of what seemed to be the dead Keynesian economics of trying to boost aggregate demand through government spending. Is this just a political response to the GFC, or is this actually the latest push for big government?
There doubtlessly are people who really believe in Keynesian economics. I'm baffled by that. It didn't work for Hoover and Roosevelt in the 30s. It didn't work for Japan in the 90s. It didn't work for Bush in 2008. It didn't work for Obama in 2009. But some people genuinely believe it. But I think a lot of politicians simply view Keynesian economics as a justification for what they like to do anyhow, which is to spend money. In some sense, Keynesian economics tells them that their vice is a virtue. Now, I'm hopeful that having seen countries not get good results from Keynesian economics after the 2008 crisis, I'm hoping that maybe it will be less likely that we'll be subjected to a bigger burden of government next time there's a recession. But I suppose we should always count on politicians justifying bigger government.
Indeed, and I think we've already seen that while politicians are very much in favour of the increased spending during downturns, they're not so big fans of pulling back spending when times are good, which I guess then leads us to the spiral of big government and what you've taken describing as a future fiscal crisis. We've got some issues here in Australia with our intergenerational transfers, but that's an issue that extends beyond just Australia, you think?
All throughout the Western world, countries are almost universally in trouble. Why? Because they have aging populations, changing demographics in other ways, fewer children, declining labor force participation. You combine those changing demographics with poorly designed entitlement programs, and you get a recipe for almost every country at some point becoming Greece. And of course, once the big countries start hitting fiscal crises, there's no capacity on the part of an IMF to bail them out, because what is the IMF? It's nothing but a proxy for bigger countries bailing out smaller countries. So I'm very worried without substantial reforms to sort of change that long-run trend of government spending. So instead of government growing faster than the private sector, it actually grows slower than the private sector. If we don't do those reforms, I think the United States, France, Germany, Australia, we're all going to be in deep trouble.
So what hope is there for this sort of fiscal consolidation? I mean, one of the things that we saw in the US was that the doomsday scenario of the sequester came and went. The economy probably picked up more than anything else. I mean, has that sort of broadened the debate about trying to consolidate the budget, reduce some of the deficit? Or is this really something that's going to have to wait for an even bigger crisis?
A big challenge we have in the United States, and also I see it in other countries as well, is a lot of people mistakenly focus on fiscal balance, deficits and debt. And the Keynesians, of course, say deficits and debt are good. The IMF types say they're bad. The Keynesians say we should increase spending. The IMF types say we should raise taxes. No. What we should focus on is the size of government spending relative to the private economy. We should be reducing the burden of government spending as a share of GDP. The sequester in the United States was great news. Now, Obama didn't want it. It was his biggest defeat of his presidency, I think, so far. But it's not as if a lot of Republicans wanted it either. It was just sort of something that was put in as part of the debt limit deal back in 2011. But we got it nonetheless. Simply because the politicians couldn't agree on an alternative. And that sequester, even though all it really did was reduce the growth rate of government spending, we made some real progress in holding government below the growth of the nominal private economy. And that's what, in the long run, reduces the burden of government spending as a share of GDP. We need more sequestration, not less. But heck, I'll take any policy that somehow reduces that trend line growth of government spending. That is the variable that matters the most.
One of the things we have seen recently, I think, and you know, you go from things like Thomas Piketty's book, is the increase in focus on inequality. One of the measures that that really is best handled by those on the left by increasing taxation and really trying to redistribute income. Is this again simply another front to try and increase government spending, or do you think that there's something that can be done about inequality as well as addressing these future fiscal issues?
The focus on inequality per se, I think, is grossly mistaken. What we should focus on is how to get faster economic growth, because faster economic growth is the way that you improve the lives of people at the bottom of the economic ladder. But if you simply take this Piketty view that the economy is a fixed pie, and a rich person can only get a bigger slice of pie by taking away some from a poor person, but that's wrong. That's not how the real world works. Or maybe it's how the real world works if you have a stagnant European-type economy. And Piketty, of course, comes from France. They're specialists in stagnant economies. But if you have a normal, well-functioning economy growing 3% a year, and if you're Hong Kong and Singapore growing 5 to 6% a year, then a rich person can become richer at the same time a poor person becomes richer. That's what we want. How do we get the kind of conditions that improve economic growth for everyone? If you have this narrow, cramped view of the economy as a fixed pie and you want to punish the rich to subsidize the poor, then in the long run, the best you can get is that you're going to make the poor poorer at a slower rate than you're making the rich poorer. And that, I think, is a recipe for economic disaster and fiscal crisis in the long run.
So we've talked a lot about some of the bad things. Who are the countries that are currently doing this well? I mean, where can we look to for inspiration in this sort of fiscal consolidation stakes?
The great thing is that the world is a laboratory. We have lots and lots of bad examples out there. You see countries like France and Italy and Spain spending themselves into crisis, and then they say, oh, we have to raise taxes, but of course all that does is it depresses the private economy further, and the politicians increase spending in the expectation and hope that they'll get more tax revenue. It's a downward spiral. More taxes, more spending, more debt, weaker economy, more taxes, more spending. It's like you're going down a toilet, and you don't want to be doing that. The good news is that we do have a small handful of good examples. Switzerland, I think, by putting in a spending cap back in the early part of last decade, has really strengthened its economy and reduced the burden of government spending at a time when all its neighbors are going in the wrong direction. I think during the global financial crisis, the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, they actually cut spending. Not in the phony way politicians talk about where, well, we're going to increase spending by this much, we only increased it by that much, so that's a spending cut. No, it's simply a smaller spending increase. The Baltic countries actually cut spending. They got out of the fiscal crisis and the financial crisis a lot faster. Their economies are growing better. So I think the lesson is, look at the countries that have figured out that the problem is spending, not deficits. And then when you figure out that the problem is spending, are you taking the steps to either reduce or at least limit the growth of government spending so that the private economy can get the breathing room to expand and create jobs and make a country more prosperous? Now, the good news, I suppose, from an Australian perspective is Australia is not in nearly as much trouble as most other OECD countries. The burden of government spending isn't as high here. There are certain policies like superannuation that have reduced long-term spending pressure on pensions. So Australia is well positioned. If it continues with good reforms, it can begin to move more in the direction of Singapore and Hong Kong, get much, much faster growth, a smaller burden of government spending. That hopefully would free up some room to lower marginal tax rates, which is one area where Australia is behind the rest of the world. The corporation tax, much too high, and I'm very disappointed that the government here has raised the income tax rate on individuals. It's one of the highest in the world already. So Australia has some good things to commend it. On the other hand, I just worry that the government might not have the commitment to keep the tax burden low and to instead focus on trying to, again, lower that trend line of government spending both now and decades in the future. That's what puts a country in a very strong position.
Dan Mitchell, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.